January 30th, 762 CE. Dawn settles slowly over the banks of the Tigris. A pale winter light spreads across open land where reeds bend in the cold wind, and surveyors stand in measured silence. The river moves steadily south, reflecting a sky the color of hammered silver. In the distance, laborers press wooden stakes into damp soil. Ropes stretch outward in perfect arcs. Geometry takes form against the earth. At the center of this vast design stands Al-Mansur, the second Abbasid Caliph. Watching as the foundation lines of circular city are marked into the dust. This will not be a camp or fortress. It will be a statement. A capital built from intention. A city shaped like a cosmic diagram, with power radiating outward from its heart. Hammers strike. Bricks are fired. Engineers calculate distances with cords and ink. Somewhere nearby, a sheet of parchment is unrolled, its surface catching the light. The faint sound of its fibers bending in the morning air drifts across the construction grounds. This is not merely the founding of a city. It is the beginning of an experiment, one that will shape half a millennium of human thought, commerce, science, and belief. The city rising from the banks of the Tigris did not emerge from peace. It was born from revolution. Just 12 years earlier, in 750 CE, the Umayyad Caliphate collapsed after decades of growing unrest. The Umayyads, ruling from Damascus, had forged an empire stretching from the Atlantic shores of Iberia to the borders of India. Yet their authority had begun to fracture under accusations of favoritism, heavy taxation, and ethnic hierarchy. Non-Arab Muslims, Persians especially, had grown resentful of second-tier status within a state that claimed universal religious leadership. From the eastern provinces of Khorasan, a movement gathered momentum under black banners. It carried both religious legitimacy and political calculation. The Abbasids, claiming descent from Al-Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, positioned themselves as restorers of justice and inclusive rule. The Abbasid Revolution culminated in the Battle of the Zab in January 750, where the last Umayyad Caliph in the east was defeated. A new dynasty took control of the Islamic world. But the Abbasids understood something essential. Authority required distance from the old order. Damascus could not remain the center. Too closely tied to Umayyad legacy, too embedded in Syrian tribal politics. It symbolized the past. The new leadership looked east. Iraq was different. It lay at the crossroads of older civilizations, Persian administrative traditions, Mesopotamian agriculture, and the commercial arteries linking India, Central Asia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. The fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates supported dense populations and stable tax revenue. Persian bureaucratic culture offered sophisticated models of governance that the Abbasids were willing to adopt. The first Abbasid capital, Kufa, proved politically unstable. Al-Hashimiyya, another early administrative center, lacked strategic depth. The dynasty needed something purpose-built, something secure, something symbolic. Thus, in 762, Al-Mansur ordered the construction of Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, known to history simply as Baghdad. Its design was deliberate. Unlike organic cities that grew through centuries of disorder, Baghdad was planned as a perfect circle nearly 2 kilometers in diameter. For gates faced the cardinal directions, opening toward Basra, Kufa, Syria, and Khorasan, a physical reminder of the empire's reach. At the exact center stood the Caliphal Palace and the Great Mosque, symbolizing the fusion of political and religious authority. The circular design was not only aesthetic. It allowed layered defense. High walls and surrounding moat protected the inner administrative core. Elite guards and trusted officials resided closest to the caliph. Beyond them lived soldiers, craftsmen, merchants, and families. It was a city organized around hierarchy, but also around movement. Caravans entering through regulated gates, goods taxed and recorded, information flowing inward. Construction required immense resources. Historical chronicles estimate that tens of thousands of laborers, engineers, and artisans participated. Bricks were baked from river clay. Timber arrived by raft. Taxes from distant provinces funded wages and materials. The project reportedly cost millions of dirhams, a reflection of imperial ambition. Yet the deeper ambition was stability. The Abbasid state was vast and diverse. It encompassed Arabs, Persians, Arameans, Turks, Berbers, and others. Muslims live alongside Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and various sectarian communities. Governing such diversity required more than military strength. It required administrative sophistication. Persian bureaucrats, many trained in Sasanian methods, became indispensable. The vizier system evolved, centralizing executive authority under appointed ministers. Record-keeping expanded. Fiscal policy became more systematic. The Abbasid Caliph was no longer merely a tribal war leader. He was an imperial sovereign overseeing a multi-ethnic empire. Baghdad embodied that transformation. Within decades, the round city's walls could no longer contain its growth. Suburbs expanded along both banks of the Tigris. Markets multiplied. Caravanserais housed traders from as far as Sind and the Byzantine frontier. Silk, spices, paper, glassware, metalwork, and manuscripts changed hands in steady rhythm. And with trade came ideas. In 751, only a year before Baghdad's founding, Abbasid forces had clashed with Tang Chinese troops at the Battle of Talas in Central Asia. Though militarily inconclusive in broader geopolitical terms, the encounter had profound technological consequences. Chinese papermaking techniques spread westward. Within decades, paper mills operated in the Abbasid realm, dramatically lowering the cost of written knowledge compared to parchment. The faint sound of turning pages would soon become one of the defining sounds of a city. By the late 8th century, under the reign of Harun al-Rashid, Baghdad had become the wealthiest metropolis in the Islamic world. Contemporary estimates suggest populations ranging from several hundred thousand to possibly over 1 million at its height, figures debated by historians but indicative of enormous scale. Diplomats from Charlemagne's court arrived. Envoys traveled east to India and China. Luxury goods filled bazaars lit by oil lamps deep into the evening. But wealth alone does not define a golden age. It is what wealth makes possible. The Abbasids invested in scholarship. Under Al-Mamun in the early 9th century, patronage of translation and scientific inquiry intensified. Greek philosophical works, Persian astronomical tables, and Indian mathematical treatises were gathered, translated, and studied. Institutions later described as the House of Wisdom became centers for intellectual exchange, though historians debate their exact structure and organization. What is not debated is the scale of intellectual ambition. Baghdad was becoming more than a capital. It was becoming an engine of synthesis, absorbing knowledge from older civilizations and transforming it. Yet beneath the prosperity and scholarship, tensions persisted. Power concentrated at the center could fracture at the edges. Regional governors sought autonomy. Military forces evolved. Ethnic balances shifted. The same mechanisms that built Baghdad would eventually test it. The city rising from the banks of the Tigris did not emerge from peace. It was born from revolution. Just 12 years earlier, in 750 CE, the Umayyad Caliphate collapsed after decades of growing unrest. The Umayyads, ruling from Damascus, had forged an empire stretching from the Atlantic shores of Iberia to the borders of India. Yet their authority had begun to fracture under accusations of favoritism, heavy taxation, and ethnic hierarchy. Non-Arab Muslims, Persians especially, had grown resentful of second-tier status within a state that claimed universal religious leadership. From the eastern provinces of Khorasan, a movement gathered momentum under black banners. It carried both religious legitimacy and political calculation. The Abbasids, claiming descent from Al-Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, positioned themselves as restorers of justice and inclusive rule. The Abbasid revolution culminated in the Battle of the Zab in January 750, where the last Umayyad Caliph in the east was defeated. A new dynasty took control of the Islamic world. But the Abbasids understood something essential. Authority required distance from the old order. Damascus could not remain the center. Too closely tied to Umayyad legacy, too embedded in Syrian tribal politics, it symbolized the past. The new leadership looked east. Iraq was different. It lay at the crossroads of older civilizations, Persian administrative traditions, Mesopotamian agriculture, and the commercial arteries linking India, Central Asia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. The fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates supported dense populations and stable tax revenue. Persian bureaucratic culture offered sophisticated models of governance that the Abbasids were willing to adopt. The first Abbasid capital, Kufa, proved politically unstable. Al-Hashimiyya, another early administrative center, lacked strategic depth. The dynasty needed something purpose-built, something secure, something symbolic. Thus, in 762, Al-Mansur ordered the construction of Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, known to history simply as Baghdad. Its design was deliberate. Unlike organic cities that grew through centuries of disorder, Baghdad was planned as a perfect circle nearly 2 kilometers in diameter. For gates faced the cardinal directions, opening toward Basra, Kufa, Syria, and Khorasan, a physical reminder of the empire's reach. At the exact center stood the Caliphal Palace and the Great Mosque, symbolizing the fusion of political and religious authority. The circular design was not only aesthetic, it allowed layered defense. High walls and surrounding moat protected the inner administrative core. Elite guards and trusted officials resided closest to the caliph. Beyond them lived soldiers, craftsmen, merchants, and families. It was a city organized around hierarchy, but also around movement. Caravans entering through regulated gates, goods taxed and recorded, information flowing inward. Construction required immense resources. Historical chronicles estimate that tens of thousands of laborers, engineers, and artisans participated. Bricks were baked from river clay. Timber arrived by raft. Taxes from distant provinces funded wages and materials. The project reportedly cost millions of dirhams, a reflection of imperial ambition. Yet the deeper ambition was stability. The Abbasid state was vast and diverse. It encompassed Arabs, Persians, Arameans, Turks, Berbers, and others. Muslims lived alongside Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and various sectarian communities. Governing such diversity required more than military strength. It required administrative sophistication. Persian bureaucrats, many trained in Sasanian methods, became indispensable. The vizier system evolved, centralizing executive authority under appointed ministers. Record-keeping expanded. Fiscal policy became more systematic. The Abbasid Caliph was no longer merely a tribal war leader. He was an imperial sovereign overseeing a multi-ethnic empire. Baghdad embodied that transformation. Within decades, the round city's walls could no longer contain its growth. Suburbs expanded along both banks of the Tigris. Markets multiplied. Caravanserais housed traders from as far as Sind and the Byzantine frontier. Silk, spices, paper, glassware, metalwork, and manuscripts changed hands in steady rhythm. And with trade came ideas. In 751, only a year before Baghdad's founding, Abbasid forces had clashed with Tang Chinese troops at the Battle of Talas in Central Asia. Though militarily inconclusive in broader geopolitical terms, the encounter had profound technological consequences. Chinese papermaking techniques spread westward. Within decades, paper mills operated in the Abbasid realm, dramatically lowering the cost of written knowledge compared to parchment. The faint sound of turning pages would soon become one of the defining sounds of the city. By the late 8th century, under the reign of Harun al-Rashid, Baghdad had become the wealthiest metropolis in the Islamic world. Contemporary estimates suggest populations ranging from several hundred thousand to possibly over 1 million at its height. Figures debated by historians, but indicative of enormous scale. Diplomats from Charlemagne's court arrived. Envoys traveled east to India and China. Luxury goods filled bazaars lit by oil lamps deep into the evening. But wealth alone does not define a golden age. It is what wealth makes possible. The Abbasids invested in scholarship. Under Al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, patronage of translation and scientific inquiry intensified. Greek philosophical works, Persian astronomical tables, and Indian mathematical treatises were gathered, translated, and studied. Institutions later described as the House of Wisdom became centers for intellectual exchange, though historians debate their exact structure and organization. What is not debated is the scale of intellectual ambition. Baghdad was becoming more than a capital. It was becoming an engine of synthesis, absorbing knowledge from older civilizations and transforming it. Yet beneath the prosperity and scholarship, tensions persisted. Power concentrated at the center could fracture at the edges. Regional governors sought autonomy. Military forces evolved. Ethnic balances shifted. The same mechanisms that built Baghdad would eventually test it. By the early 9th century, Baghdad had outgrown its original circular walls not only in size, but in complexity. The round city remained the ceremonial heart of power, yet life increasingly unfolded beyond its geometric boundaries. Wooden bridges crossed the Tigris. Entire districts spread along the eastern bank. Workshops clanged with metalwork. Tanneries released sharp odors into the air. Spice merchants opened sacks that carried the scent of India into narrow alleys. Caravans arrived in steady rhythm. From the east came silk, musk, porcelain, and paper. From the south, ivory and gold moved up from East Africa through Basra. From the north, furs and slaves traveled down the Volga trade routes. Byzantine merchants crossed frontiers, carrying textiles and knowledge. Baghdad stood at the intersection of the Silk Road, Indian Ocean trade, and Mediterranean exchange. It was not merely wealthy, it was connected. This connectivity reshaped daily life. Paper, now manufactured in Abbasid lands after the diffusion of Chinese techniques, transformed administration and scholarship. Compared to parchment, it was cheaper and easier to produce. Bureaucrats could record taxes with greater precision. Scholars could copy texts in greater numbers. Book markets flourished. Professional copyists filled entire streets. The soft rasp of pages being turned in study circles became as common as the sound of coins exchanged in markets. Under Harun al-Rashid, the court projected splendor. Chronicles describe elaborate ceremonies, diplomatic receptions, and patronage of poets and jurists. The caliphate's prestige radiated outward, reinforced by military campaigns along Byzantine frontiers and administrative consolidation within. But it was under his son Al-Ma'mun that intellectual ambition reached new intensity. Al-Ma'mun, ruling from 813 to 833, inherited not only an empire but also a civil war. His struggle against his brother Al-Amin devastated parts of Baghdad and revealed the fragility of centralized authority. Yet once victorious, Al-Ma'mun turned attention towards scholarship with deliberate focus. Translation efforts accelerated. Greek philosophical texts attributed to Aristotle and Plato were rendered into Arabic. Medical works by Galen and Hippocrates circulated widely. Astronomical tables from India were studied and refined. Scholars such as Hunayn ibn Ishaq translated complex medical treatises with technical precision, often cross-referencing Syriac and Greek manuscripts to ensure accuracy. Mathematics advanced beyond translation. Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad during the early 9th century, wrote works that systematized algebra as a discipline. His treatise on calculation by completion and balancing laid foundations that would influence mathematics for centuries. His name would later give rise to the term algorithm. These developments were not abstract luxuries. They supported astronomy, taxation, inheritance law, and engineering. Hospitals, known as bimaristans, were established with organized wards and professional physicians. Medical licensing, while not modern in form, involved examination by established doctors. Pharmacies dispensed regulated remedies. Public baths provided hygiene in a dense urban environment. Infrastructure reflected both inherited Roman-Persian traditions and evolving Islamic governance. Baghdad also housed diverse religious communities. Christian scholars, Jewish financiers, Zoroastrian administrators, and Muslim jurists coexisted within a structured but layered hierarchy. Non-Muslim communities paid the jizya tax but retained autonomy in religious affairs. Intellectual debates crossed sectarian lines, especially in philosophy and medicine. Yet pluralism did not mean absence of conflict. Theological disputes intensified during Al-Ma'mun's reign. Influenced by rationalist Mu'tazilite thought, he instituted the Mina, an inquisition beginning in 833 that sought to enforce a doctrine that the Quran was created rather than eternal. Scholars who refused faced imprisonment or punishment. Among them was Ahmad ibn Hanbal, whose resistance would later shape Sunni orthodoxy. The episode revealed that even in a flourishing intellectual climate, power could constrain thought. Meanwhile, the military structure of the caliphate was changing. Arab tribal forces gradually gave way to professional soldiers, including Turkish slave troops who would later exert significant political influence. This shift strengthened short-term security but introduced new power centers within the state. Economically, Baghdad thrived. Contemporary geographers describe markets filled with textiles, metalwork, ceramics, perfumes, and manuscripts. Credit instruments known as SAC facilitated long-distance transactions, reducing the need to carry heavy coinage. Agricultural production in Iraq's irrigated plains sustained urban density. Canals maintained under Abbasid administration preserved fertility that had supported civilizations for millennia. At its height in the 9th and 10th centuries, Baghdad likely stood among the largest cities on earth. While exact population numbers remain debated, few historians dispute its scale or its cultural gravity. It was a magnet for scholars from Central Asia, physicians from Persia, translators from Syria, and merchants from across Afro-Eurasia. But prosperity required balance. The same wealth that funded libraries also funded armies. The same diversity that encouraged innovation could ignite factional tension. Provincial governors grew powerful. Military commanders accumulated loyalty. Court intrigue intensified. The faint turning of pages continued in study halls. But beyond the walls, forces were gathering that would test the durability of this urban experiment. The city had become the intellectual heart of an empire. Now it would confront the complexities of sustaining that heart across generations. Life in medieval Baghdad cannot be understood through power alone. It must be seen at street level, in markets, workshops, schools, and homes, where empire translated into daily rhythm. At dawn, the call to prayer carried across rooftops, echoing from the great mosque and from neighborhood minarets that rose among dense clusters of homes. Bakers lit their ovens before sunrise. The smell of flatbread drifted through alleys where water carriers moved with leather skins slung across their backs. Metal workers hammered copper into bowls and lamps. In the book markets near the central districts, scribes arranged stacks of manuscripts, their fingers permanently darkened by ink. Urban life in Baghdad was structured but dynamic. Wealthy merchants lived in spacious courtyard houses, often decorated with carved wood and mosaic tile. Artisans and laborers occupied smaller dwellings in crowded quarters. Slavery existed openly. Domestic servants, agricultural laborers, military slaves, forming part of the social and economic system. Yet within this hierarchy, mobility was not impossible. Freed slaves could rise to prominence. Scholars of modest origin could gain patronage through reputation. Women participated in economic and intellectual life in ways that varied by class. Elite women sometimes sponsored mosques or charitable works. Some were known for transmitting hadith, preserving religious scholarship. Market regulations protected female property rights under Islamic law, allowing women to own businesses or inherit wealth. Social norms imposed limits, yet historical records reveal more complexity than later stereotypes suggest. Public baths served not only hygienic needs, but social ones. Coffee had not yet become central. That would emerge centuries later. But gatherings in homes and courtyards facilitated exchange of poetry, jurisprudence, and news. Music and literature flourished under court patronage. Poets recited before caliphs. Satirists critiqued corruption. Storytelling traditions evolved that would later shape compilations such as the tales associated with Baghdad's literary imagination. Commerce formed the bloodstream of the city. Merchants relied on sophisticated financial tools. The SAC, a written order to pay, enabled traders to conduct transactions across vast distances without transporting heavy coinage. Banking families managed deposits and credit. Tax registers recorded agricultural yields from Iraq's canal-irrigated lands. The fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, cultivated for millennia, supported wheat, dates, barley, and cotton. Guild-like associations regulated certain crafts. Inspectors known as mutasibs monitored market fairness, weights, and moral conduct. Price controls were occasionally imposed during shortages. State oversight did not eliminate inequality, but attempted to maintain stability in a densely populated urban environment. Beyond material exchange lay intellectual transformation. Within Baghdad scholarly circles, translation became a disciplined enterprise. Hunayn ibn Ishaq exemplified this rigor. Fluent in Syriac, Greek, and Arabic, he developed systematic methods for rendering medical texts into precise Arabic terminology. He compared multiple manuscript versions to correct errors, striving for conceptual clarity rather than literal word-for-word substitution. His translations of Galen became foundational for Islamic and later European medicine. Mathematics underwent a similar refinement. Al-Khwarizmi synthesized Indian numerical systems with earlier Greek methods. His algebraic treatises introduced systematic solutions to linear and quadratic equations. These innovations were not speculative exercises. They aided inheritance calculations, land measurement, astronomy, and taxation, practical needs of functioning empire. Astronomers under Abbasid patronage constructed observatories and refined astronomical tables. They measured the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy for the period. Physicians organized hospitals with wards separated by condition. Medical students trained under supervision. Pharmacies prepared compounds from documented formularies. Paper amplified all of it. The production of affordable writing material multiplied copies of texts. Libraries expanded. Private collectors amassed shelves of philosophy, theology, mathematics, poetry, and law. The sound of pages turning became a constant undertone in the intellectual districts. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady. Knowledge was no longer limited to rare manuscripts guarded in monastic isolation. It circulated. Yet Baghdad's brilliance was never uniform. Wealth clustered. Poverty persisted. Epidemics struck periodically, as they did in all pre-modern cities. Political rivalry simmered beneath ceremonial grandeur. Still, for generations, the city managed to sustain momentum. It functioned as a meeting point where Greek philosophy met Persian administration, where Indian numerals merged with Arabic prose, where merchants from distant lands negotiated under common commercial codes. The human, economic, and intellectual dimensions intertwined, but power always shaped the boundaries within which they operated. Power in Baghdad did not rest solely in the Caliph's palace. It radiated outward through offices, barracks, courts, and rival households, creating a political structure both sophisticated and vulnerable. At the center stood the Caliph, regarded as successor to the Prophet in temporal leadership. Yet by the 9th century, governance depended increasingly on viziers, chief ministers who managed fiscal policy, correspondence, and provincial oversight. Many came from Persian bureaucratic families, trained in administrative traditions inherited from the Sasanian Empire. Their expertise professionalized the state. Taxation became systematic. Records multiplied. Provincial governors were appointed and monitored through written directives sealed and archived. This bureaucratic refinement strengthened Baghdad's authority across vast territories. From North Africa to Central Asia, provincial administrators collected revenue and maintained order in the Caliph's name. Roads were maintained. Couriers carried decrees. Diplomatic missions moved between courts. But administration required force. During the early Abbasid period, Arab tribal armies still formed the backbone of military power. Over time, however, caliphs began recruiting Turkish slave soldiers, young men brought from Central Asia, trained intensively and bound by loyalty to the ruler. These troops, known later as Mamluks in other contexts, were professional, disciplined, and detached from local tribal politics. In the short term, they offered security against rebellion. In the long term, they altered the balance of power. Stationed in garrison towns and eventually within Baghdad itself, these soldiers became kingmakers. Their commanders gained influence over succession disputes. Caliphs who attempted to curtail their authority sometimes faced resistance or removal. The military, once an instrument of centralized authority, evolved into a political actor. Religious authority was equally complex. The Abbasid Caliphate claimed legitimacy not only through lineage but through guardianship of Islam. Yet theological debates flourished with intensity. Schools of jurisprudence developed distinct methodologies. Scholars debated the nature of divine attributes, free will, and scriptural interpretation. The Mina, initiated under Al-Mamun, demonstrated how theology could intersect with state power. By enforcing the doctrine that the Quran was created, the Caliph sought intellectual uniformity aligned with rationalist Mu'tazilite thought. Resistance from traditionalist scholars revealed a limit to caliphal authority in matters of belief. When the Mina ended under later rulers, it marked a shift. Religious scholars retained independent influence that even the Caliph could not fully command. Sunni and Shia tensions also persisted. Though the Abbasids had initially gained support from factions dissatisfied with Umayyad rule, they did not establish a Shia state. Periodic uprisings occurred in different regions. Baghdad itself, with its dense population and political symbolism, became a stage for sectarian unrest at times. By the 10th century, external pressures compounded internal strains. Regional dynasties began asserting autonomy while still nominally recognizing Abbasid spiritual authority. In 945, the Buyids, a Shia Persian dynasty, entered Baghdad and assumed control of political administration. The Caliph remained as a symbolic figurehead, but real power shifted. Later, in the 11th century, the Seljuks, a Sunni Turkic dynasty, replaced Buyid dominance, again preserving the Caliph's religious status while exercising military authority. Baghdad endured, but its sovereignty changed character. The city that had once embodied centralized imperial power now navigated layered overlordship. Viziers balanced competing interests. Military commanders negotiated alliances. Scholars adapted to shifting patrons. Through all of it, daily life continued. Markets opened at dawn. Physicians examined patients. Judges adjudicated disputes according to evolving legal schools. And in libraries and private homes, pages continued to turn. The symbolism of the book endured even as the political structure beneath it shifted. Baghdad's Golden Age was not a static era of uninterrupted brilliance. It was a dynamic equilibrium. Administrative skill, military adaptation, intellectual vitality, and economic connectivity held together through constant negotiation. But equilibrium in history is rarely permanent. The forces reshaping Eurasia in the 13th century would test Baghdad in ways no internal faction ever had. The horizon beyond the eastern frontiers was beginning to darken. By the early 13th century, Baghdad was no longer the unchallenged capital of a unified empire. The Abbasid Caliph still resided within its walls, still led Friday prayers in their name, still received envoys beneath ceremonial banners. But the structure surrounding them had thinned. Real military power lay elsewhere. Regional dynasties ruled vast territories with increasing autonomy. The Caliph's authority was moral, symbolic, and religious more than imperial. Yet the city endured. Its market still operated. Scholars still copied manuscripts. Judges still issued rulings in crowded courtyards. The Tigris still carried barges heavy with grain and timber. Baghdad remained a center of gravity, even if the political constellation had shifted. Beyond Mesopotamia, however, a new force was transforming the map of Eurasia. In the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire erupted outward from the steppes of Central Asia under Genghis Khan. Within decades, Mongol armies shattered established powers across northern China, Central Asia, and Persia. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Those that submitted were incorporated into a vast, disciplined war machine structured around mobility, intelligence networks, and psychological warfare. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire fragmented among his descendants, but expansion continued. One of those heirs, Hulagu Khan, was tasked with extending Mongol control into the Islamic heartlands. His campaign was systematic. First came the Ismaili strongholds in Persia. Mountain fortresses once considered impregnable fell under siege and calculated assault. Resistance was eliminated with precision. The message was clear. Submission ensured survival. Defiance invited destruction. Baghdad watched. The Abbasid Caliph at this time, Al-Musta'sim, ruled from 1242 onward. His position was delicate. He lacked a large standing army. The city's fortifications, though formidable in earlier centuries, had not been modernized to counter Mongol siege techniques. Diplomacy, therefore, became his primary tool. Envoys traveled between Baghdad and Hulagu's court. Mongol demands were straightforward: recognition of Mongol supremacy and material support for their campaigns. Historical accounts differ on the tone and content of exchanges, but most agree that negotiations faltered. Some chroniclers later accused the Caliph's advisors of underestimating the threat. Others suggest miscommunication or misplaced confidence that Baghdad's religious stature would deter attack. In 1257, Hulagu began moving westward in earnest. His army was not a loose tribal horde. It included engineers skilled in Chinese siegecraft, artillery units using traction trebuchets, and contingents drawn from conquered territories. Supply lines were carefully planned. Intelligence networks gathered information on fortifications and political divisions. As Mongol forces approached Mesopotamia in late 1257, fear spread along trade routes. Refugees carried stories of cities reduced to rubble. Governors in nearby regions calculated their options. Some surrendered preemptively. Baghdad hesitated. The city still possessed offensive walls, a moat, and a garrison, but its population, likely several 100,000 at this stage, was vulnerable. Its canals, once sources of agricultural wealth, could be disrupted. Its suburbs extended beyond original fortifications, difficult to defend comprehensively. In January 1258, Mongol forces encircled Baghdad. Siege lines were established with methodical efficiency. Engineers constructed siege engines within days. Archers took positions. Communication between the city and countryside was severed. Inside the walls, tension mounted. The Caliph's forces attempted sorties, but they were repelled. Mongol tactics emphasized coordinated assaults and relentless pressure. Contemporary sources, including Muslim chroniclers such as Ibn al-Athir and later historians like al-Dahabi, describe the dread that gripped the region, though exact figures and details vary across accounts. Within weeks, the outcome became unavoidable. On February 10, 1258, after negotiations and surrender attempts whose details remained debated, Mongol troops entered Baghdad. What followed is echoed through historical memory as one of the most devastating sackings of the medieval world. When Mongol forces breached Baghdad in February 1258, the city that had once symbolized intellectual radiance faced calculated destruction. Accounts from Muslim historians such as Ibn al-Fawadi and later chroniclers describe days of systematic killing and plunder. Exact numbers remain debated by modern scholars. Medieval sources sometimes claimed hundreds of thousands dead, figures likely exaggerated, yet indicative of catastrophic loss. What is historically certain is that the urban population suffered enormous casualties. Entire districts were burned. Homes were emptied. Mosques and palaces were stripped. The Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur was captured. Contemporary Mongol practice discouraged royal bloodshed by direct spilling of blood. Later accounts report that he was executed by being rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, though historians note variations in the narrative. What remains undisputed is that his death marked the end of Abbasid political sovereignty in Baghdad after nearly 5 centuries. Administrative centers were dismantled. Treasury reserves were seized. Irrigation systems that sustained the fertile plains of Iraq were disrupted, whether deliberately or through neglect amid chaos. Canals clogged. Agricultural output declined. The infrastructure that had supported dense urban life deteriorated rapidly. And the libraries. Chroniclers describe books thrown into the Tigris, manuscript destroyed, collections scattered. Some later writers spoke of the river running black with ink, a powerful image, though likely symbolic exaggeration rather than literal observation. What can be confirmed is that many repositories of scholarship were lost. Manuscripts accumulated across generations vanished in fire or dispersal. The sound that had defined Baghdad's intellectual identity, the steady turning of pages, fell silent in many quarters. Yet, even in devastation, nuance is necessary. Not every scholar was killed. Not every manuscript disappeared. Some books had already traveled to Damascus, Cairo, or other centers. Knowledge in the medieval world was not confined to one city. However luminous that city had been, Hulagu Khan established Mongol authority over the region, forming what would become the Ilkhanate. Baghdad did not cease to exist. It remained inhabited, though diminished. Trade routes shifted. Power relocated. The Abbasid line survived symbolically in Cairo under Mamluk patronage, stripped of political authority, but preserved as spiritual legitimacy. For Baghdad itself, however, 1258 marked rupture. The Golden Age, if defined by concentrated political power, economic centrality, and intellectual patronage under a unified Abbasid state, had ended. The city's population declined sharply. Infrastructure crumbled. Fields once irrigated by intricate canal systems turned to marsh or desert as maintenance lapsed. The Mongol conquest was not an isolated catastrophe, but part of a broader Eurasian transformation. Cities from Central Asia to Eastern Europe experienced similar fates. Yet Baghdad's fall resonated uniquely because of what it represented. For centuries, it had stood as a nexus of administration, scholarship, and commerce. Its destruction symbolized vulnerability, proof that even the most sophisticated urban civilization could collapse under external force. Still, history does not conclude with a single siege. Survivors rebuilt portions of the city. Mongol rulers, some of whom later converted to Islam, gradually adopted aspects of the administrative and cultural traditions they had conquered. Over time, Baghdad would reemerge as a regional center, though never again with the same global dominance it once held. The pages scattered, but the ideas did not vanish entirely. What followed reshaped not only Iraq, but the intellectual trajectory of regions far beyond the Tigris. In the months following 1258, Baghdad was a city of ash and silence. The Mongol armies did not linger indefinitely in chaotic destruction. Their objective had been achieved: eliminate Abbasid political authority and secure Mesopotamia within the expanding Ilkhanate. Yet the consequences of that objective unfolded slowly, structurally, and in many ways irreversibly. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had functioned not only as a government but as a coordinating center. Taxation records, irrigation oversight, judicial appointments, diplomatic correspondence, all had flowed through administrative networks anchored in the capital. With the death of Al-Musta'sim, that centralized apparatus collapsed. The Ilkhanate, established under Hulagu Khan, reorganized governance according to Mongol imperial models layered onto existing Persian bureaucratic systems. In some regions, administrators were retained. In others, authority shifted abruptly. Tribute obligations increased to sustain Mongol military structures. Population loss reduced the taxable base. Agriculture suffered profoundly. For centuries, Iraq's productivity had depended on an intricate canal network linking the Tigris and Euphrates. Maintenance required coordinated labor and stable oversight. In the wake of conquest, canals silted, flood control weakened. Some irrigation systems were deliberately damaged during military operations. Others simply deteriorated without state coordination. Over time, once fertile fields reverted to marshland or arid ground. Urban decline followed rural contraction. While Baghdad remained inhabited, its population fell dramatically compared to its 9th and 10th century heights. Trade routes adjusted to new political realities. Some merchants redirected activity towards cities, such as Tabriz, which rose under Ilkhanid patronage. Others strengthened connections with Cairo, where the Mamluk Sultanate positioned itself as defender of the Islamic heartlands after defeating a Mongol force at Ain Jalut in 1260. The Abbasid lineage did not vanish entirely. A surviving member of the family was installed in Cairo under Mamluk authority, maintaining a ceremonial caliphate stripped of executive power. The symbolic continuity mattered politically, reinforcing Mamluk legitimacy, but Baghdad itself no longer held that spiritual centrality. Intellectually, the loss was uneven. Many manuscripts had already circulated across the broader Islamic world before 1258. Scholarship was decentralized by nature. Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and cities in Persia and Central Asia maintained their own scholarly communities. The destruction in Baghdad severed a major hub, but not the entire network. Yet the psychological impact was immense. For generations, Baghdad had embodied confidence in administration, in commerce, in intellectual ambition. Its fall altered perception. Chroniclers wrote with a tone of mourning. Later historians would mark 1258 as a symbolic end of an era, even if cultural and scientific development continued elsewhere. Under subsequent Ilkhanid rulers, especially after the conversion of Ghazan Khan to Islam in 1295, efforts were made to stabilize and rebuild. Persian bureaucrats regained influence. Trade revived gradually. Artistic and architectural patronage emerged in other cities of the Ilkhanate. The Mongols themselves adapted, adopting aspects of Islamic governance and culture. Baghdad persisted but transformed. No longer the unquestioned center of a vast empire, it became one city among many within a shifting regional order. Its scale contracted, its authority diluted. Its myth, however, grew. The memory of the Golden Age, of scholars, markets, and turning pages, began to crystallize into narrative. In the decades and centuries after 1258, The idea of Baghdad began to travel farther than the weakened city itself. While political gravity shifted toward Cairo under the Mamluks and later toward emerging Ottoman power, the intellectual currents that had once converged in Baghdad did not vanish. They dispersed. Manuscripts copied in earlier centuries circulated through Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo. Works associated with scholars, such as Al-Khwarizmi, continue to shape mathematical thought far beyond Mesopotamia. Medical texts translated by figures like Hunayn ibn Ishaq survived in multiple copies, some eventually reaching Latin Europe through translation movements in Spain and Sicily. The so-called Golden Age was never confined to a single moment or a single city. It was a network of scholars, merchants, administrators, and patrons stretching across Afro-Eurasia. Baghdad had functioned as its brightest node, but not its only one. In the 14th century, the Ilkhanate fragmented. New regional powers rose and fell. Timur's campaigns in the late 14th century brought further destruction to parts of Iraq, compounding earlier demographic and infrastructural decline. By the time the Ottomans incorporated Baghdad in the 16th century, the city remained historically significant but no longer globally dominant. Yet memory persisted. Later historians, both within the Islamic world and beyond, look back to the Abbasid centuries as a benchmark of intellectual vitality. The narrative of a luminous capital where philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine flourished became part of cultural identity. In Europe, as Renaissance scholars engaged with classical knowledge reintroduced through Arabic intermediaries, the indirect influence of Abbasid-era scholarship became increasingly visible. Algebra, numerals, medical theory, and preserved Aristotelian philosophy had traveled complex routes, but many of those routes passed through Baghdad's scriptoria and study circles. The sound of turning pages, once literal in the markets near the Tigris, echoed metaphorically across continents. Modern historians, however, approached the Golden Age with nuance. It was not an uninterrupted era of tolerance and prosperity. It included political repression, sectarian conflict, slavery, economic inequality, and violent succession struggles. It rose within imperial structures and fell amid imperial collapse. Its achievements were collective, cumulative, and dependent on earlier civilizations, Greek, Persian, Indian, and others. Baghdad's story complicates simplistic narratives of rise and fall. It demonstrates that intellectual flourishing depends on material foundations, stable governance, trade connectivity, surplus wealth, and institutional support. When those foundations fracture, scholarship suffers, though it rarely disappears entirely. Today, archaeological remains and scattered manuscripts offer partial glimpses of that medieval metropolis. The round city's precise layout survives mostly in textual descriptions. Canals once vital to agriculture lie altered or erased. Yet the historical record, chronicles, biographies, surviving treatises, allows reconstruction of a civilization that shaped global thought. Baghdad did not remain the center of the world, but for roughly 5 centuries, it functioned as one of its great crossroads. The pages it once turned continue to influence classrooms, laboratories, and libraries far removed from the Tigris. Baghdad, in its full medieval grandeur, reminds us that human achievement is fragile yet enduring. Stone walls, soaring minarets, and bustling markets may crumble. Canals may silt and dynasties may fall. Yet ideas, once committed to ink and paper, migrate, survive, and transform distant worlds. The turning of a page, once a literal sound in a house of wisdom, in market stalls, in private study, becomes a symbol of persistence. Mathematics travels westward. Medicine crosses deserts and seas. Philosophy navigates cultures and languages. Even in the aftermath of conquest and ruin, the rhythm of learning continues, imperceptible but unbroken. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been a nexus where cultures intersected, knowledge accumulated, and governance experimented with inclusion and sophistication. Its rise demonstrated the power of vision, planning, and intellectual ambition. Its fall revealed the limits of even the most vibrant civilization when confronted with external force and internal fragility. Yet the human impulse to preserve, to read, to write, and to teach endures. In this sense, Baghdad never truly vanished. Its legacy lives in libraries from Cairo to Cordoba, in algebra classrooms around the globe, in hospitals still inspired by centuries-old scholarship. The Golden Age was not eternal, but the echo of its pages endures. In the hush of a library, in the careful turn of a manuscript, one can still hear Baghdad, the city of peace, of knowledge, and of aspiration, whisper across time. The story of Baghdad teaches a larger truth. Civilization may falter, empires may crumble, but knowledge, once freed, becomes immortal.